The Zone Coverage Podcast Network.
They may be drinkers, Robin, but they're also human beings.
Hell yeah, let's get Stinko.
This is the Giles and the Goalie podcast as part of the Zone Coverage Podcast Network. With your hosts, Giles Farrell and Ben Remington.
Welcome to the Giles and the Goalie podcast. I am Giles Farrell, as always joined by Ben Remington.
Hello.
Coming to you with a special podcast. Today we are going to be joined by the great Michael Russo of The Athletic. You can also find him on his podcast. He does the Russo Hockey Show, as well as Straight from the Source, on The Athletic. And, he's also a contributor at KFAN. So basically, he's everywhere. And we were fortunate enough to have him for a little bit. And we tried to come up with some questions for him that you don't normally hear because, as I just said, he is literally everywhere as the king of Minnesota Wild coverage. So hopefully we can find some questions that you never otherwise heard Mr. Russo go on about.
I'm going to ask him about Kirill Kaprizov right away.
Right. We did give a little bit of a buffer, and he was appreciative of that because we have to ask, but we also didn't want to just dive right into it because honestly, it's we had a joke about it on Twitter the other day, so it was just right. It's a lot for him right now. So it's good. We won't waste too much time here at the front. I just will apologize. During the middle of this, my cats in the background decided to have a full-on brawl. So if you catch any of that audio, I apologize, but I don't think you'll be able to hear it. But just an anecdote I wanted to share before we get to Mr.
I didn't hear it for what it's worth.
Okay. Yeah, they full-on were brawling. It was reminiscent of the '96 Avalanche Red Wings line
nice.
brawl. So it was
nice.
it was something. So
cool.
Yeah. So without going too much more into the cat fight that was going on, we will let you get to our chat with Mike. All right. Joining us now on the Giles and the Goalie podcast hotline is the literal king of the Minnesota Wild news cycle, and that is Michael Russo. Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's been a tough week, obviously, with everything going on, and obviously with everything going on in the Twin Cities and the just senseless death of George Floyd. It's almost been very, very hard to it's been very hard to concentrate and be motivated to write about sports this week. That's for sure. It was not one of my most productive weeks I've ever had at The Athletic, and hopefully everybody's safe and healthy out there. With you almost forget that we're in the middle of a global pandemic as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can completely relate to that. I was supposed to write about Jonas Brodin on Monday, and I just couldn't pull myself to it, so I took the week off, and thankfully my editors were kind enough to let me do that because it felt too weird. So there was a lot to think about this week. But how have you survived during this pandemic? Because it's just been a complete change of lifestyle for everyone, but you specifically, because you're almost always on the road. You get 2 weeks at a time here in Minnesota, and then you're out on the road for seemingly 2 weeks at a time during the hockey season.
Yeah, it's been definitely different, and I can't wait to get on a plane again. Right now I'm continuing to stay in Minnesota, and I think I'm going to continue to stay in Minnesota and not do anything that could potentially make me sick. Also, because I want to make sure that if the NHL allows us to start covering training camp and games, that I'm doing nothing to potentially jeopardize that, because I assume that if we're going to be allowed to cover, we're going to have to, be tested as often as the players if we're going to be inside their bubble, and also, just one of those things where you just feel like if I'm going to be with the players, I don't want to do anything at all to potentially make myself sick or anything like that. So it's just been really interesting just being at home for as long as I have. I mean, as everybody knows out there, you get into these routines, and when you're a hockey writer, you just constantly you almost crave that times where you get on airplanes and go stay in hotels and go be in hockey rinks mostly and in press boxes. And that's what I can't wait to get back to. But I will say the one thing I've learned during this pandemic, guys, is that human beings are like the grossest people ever. The grossest things ever. Like, I have not, like, just a great example is, like, I haven't even had the sniffles in 3 months, and it just shows you that getting on airplanes and, being around other people and things like that is really what makes us all sick, right? I mean, it's I don't know about you guys, but I've been completely feeling great for 3.5 months, and it just shows you that like clockwork, when I get sick every 2 months during a hockey season, why that is. It's just being in locker rooms, being on airplanes, being in hotel rooms, being around others.
Yeah, I hear you. My son went back to daycare for the first time in 2 months this week and has a runny nose already. So it's instantaneous.
Yeah, and it just really just shows you that. I mean, again, I'm not a science guy, but it just shows you that you don't just get sick naturally just from walking around the your community or whatever, or taking walks in a forest, or some of the things I've been doing a lot lately. It's just being around other humans. So but I am craving. I just cannot wait to sit on an airplane again and pull up my laptop and write. And mostly, I just can't wait to cover hockey again. That's why I do the job. It's not to sit in my office and make up stories and things like that. That should be in the arenas and cover these games, because that's why we all love the sport.
So on covering hockey, one of the things I wanted to ask you, not to pump your tires a whole lot, but you were kind enough to join this podcast, so why not? But it's just your coverage of the Wild since you started in 2005, if I remember right, has just been so great and so thorough. And I never encounter someone when we talk about, hey, I read this piece by such and such. It's always, I was reading Russo, and you have single-handedly, kind of cornered this market, not to put down the other great writers in the market, but you've kind of single-handedly cornered the Twin Cities market for Wild coverage. And I wanted to ask you, how have you been able to do that? Because everyone, and I mean everyone, reads your stuff.
Well, I appreciate it. I hope more people do, because obviously, I mean, you saw the news with The Athletic yesterday. We need engagement and subscribers and things like that. And I really appreciate you saying that. And honestly, I was talking to a kid the other day that goes to, I think, Centennial High School, and he was asking me, how to become a sports writer and all that stuff. And he's writing for one of the local blogs in the area. And I actually told him to read you, Giles, because, I'm amazed at just the story ideas that you constantly come up with and stuff that, there's about 15 things that you've written during this pause. And that right when you wrote it, I read it and I'm like, God, I wish I wrote that story, or even thought of that idea, or frankly had the stamina to do it. Because I will say, where my strengths are is actually reporting news, where, in coming up with actual story ideas and then expanding it out in an analytical point of view, throwing GIFs on there, as you know, because we steal all your GIFs. That stuff is not my specialty. And so, I think one reason why I think that people that read me is one is from a reporting standpoint is that I do work hard on it. And it's not just, it really isn't, that I'm just constantly this bulldog that's trying to get news. A lot of it's just simple daily conversations that I have with a lot of friends of mine in hockey. Yesterday, in fact, I talked to a coach in the NHL that, just happened in our conversation, dropped something on me that I'm like, whoa, I did not know that. And now I'm going to pursue it. And that's what I mean is that this is just what I do on a daily basis. I mean, every day I'm talking and to all my friends are in hockey, and so a lot of it's that. And then a lot of it, I think, is personality. I mean, I'm probably overexposed. It's right when I got here in 2005, I was a local agent actually in town here. Called me up, and his name is Barney Harris, longtime NHL agent, NFL agent. He calls me up and he goes, "Hey, we got to get you on the radio. Can you mind if I set up meetings?" And he set up meetings with a lot of the different radio stations, and we started Russo Radio on KSTP at 1500, and I was doing stuff with Matt Thomas, who used to be there, and Joe Anderson and people like that. And then all of a sudden, when the Wild got picked up at the Fan, they called me up. Paul Allen was actually the one that facilitated, and he said, "We got to get you on the Fan." And I think it's been about, probably 10 years now that I've been on the Fan. And then the other thing is that, the advent of Twitter. We started a Twitter account in 2009, essentially because I got scooped on a story nationally. I was in Montreal and didn't have a way to get it up real quick. So they started this Twitter account for me when I was at the draft in Montreal, and kind of, and then it's just kind of creating your brand and and showing people your personality on Twitter and things like that. And then, fortunately and very unfortunately, there's been a lot of breaking news that I've been able to break on Twitter that got me followers and people like that somehow haven't left. And when I say unfortunately, I'm thinking about stuff like, the Derek Bugard death and the Josh Harding story and things like that, things that all of a sudden, if I look back and if you go through my Twitter analytics and see where I got the biggest boost of Twitter followers, it was sometimes not just during the Parisi and Suter negotiations or breaking trades. It was sometimes some really sad tragedies or sad stories that I reported. So, Twitter's been a good way to kind of build that brand. And then the other thing is obviously, the podcast and just being able to, go on there and give people a little glimpse of who I am and kind of a face behind just the byline. And so, it's been, I love it here. I've had many, many, many chances to leave, and I always seem to wind up staying. And now I think like all of us, especially the fans that are this team, and then the people that are supposed to be impartial like me, I think all of us want to just now be around a winner and see this team actually do something. Because as you know, I mean, as objective as you have to be covering a team, guys, I mean, we all want to be around a winner and cover a winner and cover long playoff runs. And that's the one thing that I have long missed by covering the Minnesota Wild is not getting that opportunity to when I've covered Stanley Cup Finals, it's covering Pittsburgh and it's covering Nashville and it's covering San Jose and Anaheim and Ottawa. I've been to a bunch of Stanley Cup Finals, but never the Minnesota Wild. And I think that's what I would give anything right now. I would crave to be able to document a Stanley Cup Final run for the great fans here in Minnesota.
Yeah, on that note, we've talked to a lot of people about this, and obviously the well-anticipated arrival of Kirill Kaprizov is front of mind. But how close do you think the Wild are? Where do you think they're at as far as building a legitimate cup contending team? Is Kaprizov get them most of the way there? Do they still need a goalie, a first-line center? How close do you think they are?
Well, first of all, I appreciate you guys waiting 10 minutes into the show to ask me about Kaprizov. That was the longest.
I didn't ask about Kaprizov technically. I did not ask about him technically.
I even did Vancouver radio the other day, and the first question they asked me was about Kaprizov. So I do appreciate it. It's a great question. The one thing I will say is, is that he's a fantastic player, and I think he has the opportunity to be a game-changing type player in the NHL. But I'm still one of those people that think that you build through centers and you build through goalies and you build through top 2D. And so while, a scoring winger is going to be absolutely fantastic, and I think all of us know that if the Wild could develop a superstar, it would be absolutely sensational for the organization to have that game-breaking type. And we saw it with Fiala. We've seen it with Gaborik in the past. until this team gets a true number one center and a number one goalie that's going to ride them as well, I don't think that just a scoring winger can win you Stanley Cups. Otherwise, Washington would have 15 in a row, right? Not just one
right.
in Ovechkin's, 14th or 15th year in the NHL. To me, that's the big thing is that they still, Billy Guerin still has work to do from that standpoint. And maybe Kakanen's that guy. But until you have a true goalie that's going to bring you a long way, and I don't think you need a Carey Price type, because that's the one thing I think that we're even seeing with Montreal is that if you find a number one goalie, goalies fluctuate so much that, if you overspend, if you get a guy 8-year deal at $10 million apiece, that could absolutely sink you. We see every single year that the Jordan Binningtons of the world and there's very few dominant goalies for long stretches in the National Hockey League because it's such a difficult position. So, I think I'd love to see Kakkonen. I'm one of those people that actually would not mind seeing Kakkonen just kind of thrown to the wolves. And that's the wrong way to say it, because I don't Vancouver Canucks are this dominant team. But I do think that I would like to see, potentially Billy Guerin basically say to Dean Evison, I don't care if Alex Stalock is absolutely dominant in training camp. I need to learn about Kakkonen right now, and we'll see if he succeeds or flounders. And I think that would be a very smart thing for the organization. And then again, I just think up the middle, the Wild just have to do a much, much better job of developing and acquiring centers, because I just think that's what you need to go far in the National Hockey League. But again, I'm not taking anything away from Kaprizov. There's multiple pieces of the pie that make you successful, but I still don't think that Kirill Kaprizov is going to come here and lead a team to a cup right away.
Right.
Yeah, we didn't want to, ask too many Kaprizov questions because we just assumed that you've muted that word on Twitter as it's one of the more it's got to be one of the most asked questions you've ever had on Twitter, I would assume.
Yeah, but as we were joking around the other day on Twitter, you and I, is that every year there's something, or every couple of months there's some sort of question that just drags on, and we've seen it forever. Backstrom questions: are they going to buy this guy out? Are they going to acquire this guy? There's always something. Kaprizov's the one that's just lasted now 2 or 3 years, and it's a fascinating story because there's just there's multiple delicate levels to this story that I can't even really get into. One day I would love to just give everybody the ins and outs of everything that's completely going on. And unfortunately, a lot of times with Kirill Kaprizov, a lot of times you got to read my stories and sort of read between the lines of what I'm saying. Right. I do think that here, as I wrote about 3 or 4 Kaprizov stories ago, and probably 2 or 3 weeks ago at this point, there have been a lot of positive steps in the last couple of weeks in terms of getting Kaprizov signed. He's got himself representation. The contract's essentially done. Now what he is waiting for is the National Hockey League and the National Hockey League Players Association to resolve this issue on whether or not he could play this summer. There's multiple layers to this. I think the NHL looks at it as you once, I think, wrote a column ripping on my source, Giles, calling him a ringer. The NHL, it's probably not the greatest term that they've used, and people have now jumped on that description. But what the NHL's point is that in a normal situation, there would not be hockey played in August. So Kirill Kaprizov would not be allowed to play against the Vancouver Canucks. And so what they feel is it would be unfair to open the can of worms for teams to essentially just add players that weren't on their roster before. And the reason also is that they feel like it takes away jobs from other players, where what becomes hypocritical then is why is Kakkonen allowed to play? Kakkonen would be taking the job away from Stalock or Dubnyk potentially. Same thing with Mayhew theoretically, or anybody else. So they kind of contradicted themselves there. But the NHLPA is fighting this for one real big reason. It's not because they feel like this is unfair to the Minnesota Wild, that this was this long-standing collectively bargained thing that the league is trying to arbitrarily change. The reason why the NHLPA is fighting this is because this infuses potentially a ton of money into players' pockets in a year or so. And what I mean by that is that by the Kaprizov not being allowed to, under league rules, play this summer, that means that he would not be able to burn that first year of the contract this summer, which means that next summer he wouldn't get his very, very expensive second contract that just pumps a bunch of money into the system. And they don't think that it's fair that the NHL is just arbitrarily changing that. From a Minnesota Wild perspective, what a lot of fans have pointed out is that it would be much, much better for the Wild not to have him burn the first year and not play a few games this summer, because then that saves them a year from having to overpay him on a second contract. And make no mistake, Billy Guerin's going to have to throw the freaking world at Kirill Kaprizov whenever his first contract, his entry-level deal is up. And the reason, and I'm not trying to scare Wild fans a lot, but Wild fans have waited so long for this kid and want to see him so badly in Minnesota Wild uniform. And even if he signs this summer, he could leave in Minnesota in 4 years. And so when his entry-level contract is up, in order to make sure that Kirill Kaprizov does not become an unrestricted free agent in the summer of 2024, it doesn't matter what Kirill Kaprizov does in his first year with the Minnesota Wild. Billy Guerin might have to throw him an 8-year contract at insane money. And so from a Minnesota Wild perspective, it's actually better if the NHL decides that he can't play this summer. But the NHL doesn't want to risk him re-signing in the KHL for a year. And they want to get him here and start getting acclimated to the Twin Cities and things like that. So that's the whole goal here, is to just get him here. And hey, I mean, in a 5-game series against Vancouver, to get back to Ben's original question, I mean, Kirill Kaprizov could win them a series. He's got that type of talent. So this is not necessarily just going to be for a couple games. I mean, the Wild could potentially get a playoff run out of this.
Right.
So I guess to change gears a little bit, not to make this totally Kaprizov centric, you mentioned the Wild goaltending. I guess one question is, without going into too much detail, is there any update on Devin Dubnyk's situation with his wife? Because I know it was pretty serious during the season, and obviously we want the best for everything that was going on, and hopefully there's been some kind of positive news on that front.
Yeah, they really believe that the surgery that she had in January has started to address what was a very, very scary situation. I haven't talked to Dubnyk in about a week, but I've talked to him a ton during the pause for multiple reasons. Features I've been writing, and we had a Zoom with him. But then the other big thing is, he's the Wild player rep, so he's kind of who I touch base with on a lot of things. But his wife was doing really, really well, and has been, thank God, doing great since this January operation that she had. And so that's the hope, is that she's on the, kind of road to recovery on something that again, was frightening. I'm trying to preserve their privacy a lot, but and choose my words here. But right now, thank goodness, she is doing really well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's just another weird off situation that seemingly the Wild are always finding themselves in. That's another thing I wanted to ask. We've seen so many weird situations happen with the Wild during your time covering them. There's been the truck fire in Ottawa, the almost catastrophic fire that nearly took out the Wild front office when they were having an off-season meeting. Have you seen this many weird scenarios happen just to one franchise?
I mean, I'm sure any beat writer that covers a team could probably give you a laundry list of weird, tough things. But you're right. I mean, the two fires were incredible. The one that you're referring to was every August, actually except last August because of the GM search. But every August at Craig Leopold's lake home in Wisconsin, he has a retreat for not only just the Wild front office, but the coaches and then the hires up in the business house. So the Matt Makers of the world, Jeff Pellegrins, people like that. And apparently at his lake home in Wisconsin, there's sort of a secondary, let's call it a guest house, a super old guest house that I believe has a sauna or I can't remember the story I wrote, but had a fire pit or something right next to it. And in the middle of the night, I believe it was Jim Mill that woke up. It was Jim Mill, Brent Flair, and Chuck Fletcher. So Chuck Fletcher, the GM, Brent Flair, his longtime right-hand man, and Jim Mill, who's director of hockey operations for the Wild at the time. He's now a scout with the New Jersey Devils, and also, by the way, one of Billy Guerin's best friends. He woke up, thankfully, in the middle of the night and discovered that their little house was on fire. And he was able to essentially get Chuck Fletcher and Brent Flair out of there before the whole thing went up in a blaze. And we're talking rural Wisconsin. It took forever for the firefighters to get there. They were worried about the major house as well, because we're talking in the woods and things like that. So it's a scary. It is typical. I mean, I see all the things about about people discussing the Wild on my comments and Twitter and things like that, and it does seem like this is only a Minnesota thing, where you finally have Kirill Kaprizov coming and a global pandemic hits. Same thing. I mean, we just saw it yesterday at the Athletic. I mean, we've been absolutely just rocking it for the last 2 years and growing and nearly 1 million subscribers and just absolutely awesome. And yesterday we had to lay off 46 people and take pay cuts around the horn as well. And it's because, it's like, who could have ever envisioned a global pandemic hitting? So I think anybody is looking at stuff like that, not just the Minnesota Wild, as being something that affect their franchise, but it certainly feels like the Minnesota Wild at times has some sort of curse. I mean, just look at the Winter Classic, guys. I mean, they've waited years to get the thing. And now all of a sudden you can't even potentially have fans in the stands, let alone if you even can have fans in the stands at that time in January 1, how many you're going to be allowed in the stadium. And then again, who's buying tickets right now to the Winter Classic? So, I mean, it's just, you can't even make it up sometimes, the bad luck of the Minnesota Wild.
Yeah. So speaking of bad luck for Minnesota Wild, I wanted to ask you this for a long time. You wrote a pretty great article introducing Paul Fenton to Wild fans as kind of this, he had worked a long time towards it, and was very deserving, and was kind of an intense guy, but it kind of worked. Fast forward, was it 14, 15 months to the article you wrote, kind of outlining what went wrong and kind of where all the missteps were and how it was very staff based, why he was let go. My question was there any point in between there? Was there any point during the season where something happened, behind the scenes, maybe not too behind the scenes, where you were like, oh, wow. And was it anything that you sort of saw coming, or was it as much of a surprise to you as it was everybody else?
Well, I mean, I could answer this like a lot of things I answer in a very convoluted way. I'll say this. When he was fired, I was absolutely shocked. But the fact that he was fired, I was not shocked, because all summer, I mean, as you saw the day that I broke the story, that story was written. All I had to do was change. That story was in my computer in April, because I knew behind the scenes that there were a lot of people not happy with what he was doing. And I was starting to get word that his job was very much on the line. And that he had a couple come to Jesus meetings with Craig Leopold, where he put him absolutely on notice. And so that story, and that I wasn't able to break that story with a 2,000, 3,000 word article in 2 minutes. It was written in my laptop. But all year, it was a slow drip. I mean, all year long, it was just, I mean, there were so many things, guys, that just, from a morale perspective, a lot of people just were not happy inside the organization in every single department. And look, Paul Fenton would still be the GM of the Minnesota Wild if he had Bill Guerin's personality, most likely. Because again, if he was fired because of hockey reasons, it would have happened in April. But the fact that it happened in late July, when everybody was essentially asleep, in total off-season mode, just shows you that stuff behind the scenes was happening from a personality standpoint that Craig Leopold and Matt Maka just couldn't accept anymore. And so the decision was made to move on from him. But Bill Guerin, is very good friends with Paul Fenton. He knows Paul a lot better than me. They're from the same area of Massachusetts. And I think that, deep down now in hindsight, we look at a lot of the moves that Paul Fenton made, and they absolutely so far have worked. And what's really interesting is a lot of the things that Paul Fenton planned has come into fruition with Bill Guerin at the helm. Kevin Fiala is a superstar. His handpicked coach, Dean Evison, is the coach. His son is running the draft. It's just, and here Paul Fenton doesn't even get to see the fruits of that labor, like often happens in the NHL, by the way. I can't tell you how many times teams win Stanley Cups and the guy that created the team is no longer there. Look at Rick Dudley in Tampa Bay. Look at Dale Talon in Chicago. Look at Brian Murray in Anaheim. It's happened in a lot of different places. Paul, if this team continues to rise here and play well, and some of the guys that he brought in are big reasons for that, I think that you could, Paul Fenton will have a big hand in that. But, there was, I don't want to get into every single thing, but there was a lot of, trust me, there was a lot of stuff in that Paul Fenton story that I wrote after he was fired, like a week later in the analysis, that I left out, people read that story like, people read that story like it was, like a Dateline investigation, and yet I guarantee you that Paul Fenton read that story and almost was like relieved at some of the stuff that I didn't put in there that he knows that I knew. So, there's just one of those things where there's certain things that you have to be professional and not throw in there, and there was just a lot of stuff that went on behind the scenes that was just troublesome.
Yikes.
So to kind of follow up on this, during Paul Fenton's brief time, you time and time again noted that he was always trying to find out who was essentially leaking stuff to the media, and basically really went way too far after that. It's kind of a weird time, and sometimes I kind of worry about the time for journalism, because we essentially live in a time now where everyone just cries fake news if they don't agree with something that gets written. Do you think on that a lot? Because I don't dive too much into journalism outside of sports, but when I do, it's something I really casually think about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very concerned with just the fact that a lot of our society just thinks that we are the enemy of the people. And when I say we, I shouldn't even say we, because sports writers are just, in the grand scheme of life, we're on the low end of what journalism is really, the importance of it. So that does scare me. In terms of just me specifically and sports writers in general, I mean, I could tell you that the only thing I want to be is accurate. And I think most people respect that. I think most people in the business know that. I will say the thing that Paul Fenton brought here was just troublesome from the very beginning. I mean, even before he got here, Ben mentioned the feature that I wrote on him to introduce him to Wild fans. Paul could not have been more uncooperative for that story. But yet all his friends, his brother, they were all incredible for the story. But Paul, barely gave me an interview, and he wouldn't send me pictures. And it was bizarre from the very beginning, when all you're doing is introducing the man to Wild fans, the same way that I've done with everybody that I've ever covered in my career, from John Torchetti to Mike Yeo and Bruce Boudreau to Dean Evison. I remember when Dean Evison took over in February, some Wild fans commented on my thing, "Oh, what are you writing this fluff piece on the new coach?" I'm like, because nobody knows who he is other than Paul Fenton chose him. I want to tell you who he is. That's the job. And from Paul's perspective, it never made sense to me that he came here from the very start, and right at the very start, and almost it was like, I'm going to show Russo that he is, that he's got no influence, and he just tried to pick fights with me left and right. And it's, starting at the draft in Dallas, when I broke the story that, the Tyler Ennis, Jason Zucker, Nino Niederreiter story for Dvorak and Domi. I mean, it was scary the way that he reacted, and the way that he reacted on his staff, trying to figure out who potentially leaked me that story, when I could tell you it didn't come from inside the organization. And it just never, ever ended from there. And it became a stressful being all season long, because I was always worried about getting people fired. Every single thing I put in print, I was worried about, right, who's he going to blame this on, even if they had no clue, that I was even writing it or that it was even going on. And so it just became, it was really amazing to me where, where I could tell you the person I'm dealing with now as the GM of the Minnesota Wild couldn't be more opposite. Bill Guerin is extremely accessible. If you have a question, he wants you to ask it, whether it's text, email, calls, whatever. He just wants me to be accurate. And that's all I want. I want to tell Wild fans what's going on. I don't want to be fake news. I don't want to throw stuff against the wall. I think probably, the one biggest frustration that Wild fans sometimes have with my writing is that I don't sit there and entertain rumors unless I know it to be going on. And when I get something wrong, it kills me. It bothers me. I had, I will say I threw something into a story, into a speculative piece that I wrote before the trade deadline, where I just broached the subject of maybe Max Domi made sense for the Minnesota Wild. And it was something that wasn't going on, but it was taken as gospel in Montreal and created a huge distraction in Montreal. And it killed me for a week. I was so upset with that again, I kind of broke my own rule there because I don't like to just throw stuff out there as like, I don't like inventing stuff. And then sometimes at The Athletic, they do want us to write columns and come up with good trade ideas and things like that. And the reason why I don't like to do it is because from a respected journalist standpoint, if you write a name out that just says, hey, this might make sense, even though you might paint it very clearly that it was a speculation and conjecture and, invented in my own head, in today's day and age, it goes on the rumor sites, it goes on sports radio and other markets, and it becomes a distraction in that locker room. And so, I hate being that guy. And so, I don't want to say I'm trying to be the one journalist that's like, I'm going to show everybody I'm not fake news, but I want Wild fans to know that when they're reading me, it's really stuff that I'm hearing that's going on through sources of mine, not just stuff that they could just take for a grain of salt. And that's why I think a lot of Wild fans, a lot of times when I do mailbags or they ask me a rumor question on Twitter, I a lot of times will ignore it because I know that if I just, even the other day, just me writing back to you guys as fun about Jack Eichel, all of a sudden somebody in Buffalo took it as I was saying Eichel is potentially coming to Minnesota, and it wound up on a, so like, it just, I feel like, I know that sometimes sports is supposed to be entertainment, and I think a lot of times most intelligent sports fans know if the beat writer's just kind of having fun with you and discussing possibilities. But in today's day and age, nothing is just nothing's just kept here in Minnesota. Everything's just out there public. So I just try to be careful.
Right. All right. On to things that are probably a little bit easier for you to talk about. The return that the NHL has kind of laid out, we got the full story of it, a couple weeks ago now, or a week ago now. Seems like they're pretty locked in place. Do you see, what are the biggest hangups to this return plan? And do you think that one of the issues that I had with it, and I kind of understand it in the realm of they want fans in the seats for the following season, but how far do you think this pushes out, and do they not start the following season until January, which as we well know, could endanger Kaprizov? But what do you see as hangups for this return 2014 playoff?
To get to your point, I think 100% next season doesn't start until late December or January. I mean, you just do the math now. If training camp isn't to the second week of July, and it's a 2.5 to 3 week training camp, that means games don't start till August, and you have a 5-game play-in series, and the playoffs usually take 2 months. Now, there won't be travel involved, but you still can't play back-to-backs, and you got to give guys time to off. So, there could very well, if you start early August, you don't have a Stanley Cup award until mid-October. Well, then you need an off season because you have to have a draft, you have to have free agency, you have to have a trade set up, you have to allow guys a little time off, and then training camp for the next season. So, I mean, just do the math. We're talking late December, January. As far as things that could foul this up, there's probably 3 things in my mind. One, that might be the most important thing that I know fans don't give a crap about, but one is escrow, the economics of what is going on in terms of the damage to revenue versus how much this is going to hurt the players here in the next couple of years. 2, is COVID-19 and keeping these guys safe. And 3 is, what will life be in that bubble? How strict will it be? The one good news that I've heard here in the last couple of days that I will write a big story on early next week that was supposed to run this past week, but I just honestly couldn't concentrate with some of the news that was going on in the Twin Cities and yesterday with the Athletic is I talked to Bill Maurice, the head chair of one of the head doctors over at Mayo Clinic. And Bill is very confident that thinks it's very feasible that the NHL can pull off a bubble. That first of all, in 8 weeks from now, when these guys are going to be playing, there's going to be multiple treatments for COVID-19. There's going to be antibody tests. He does feel like actually I shouldn't put words in his mouth, but it does feel like people aren't getting nearly as sick lately from COVID-19. And the other thing is just the risk factor for hockey players and their fitness level. It's very hard for them to be affected by this illness, like a lot of obviously senior citizens or other people with existing conditions and underlying factors and things like that. But he also feels that if you bring everybody to a hub city and you quarantine them for 5 or 6 or 7 days and make sure that then you test them where because it takes a little while for once this virus is in your system to actually show up and be where you're symptomatic and that you'd be able to be tested positive. That is, as long as you continually test these players and they are being negative, that means that you could actually, as long as you keep this bubble tight, that you could bring them to the arenas, have them play hockey like they normally do, and everybody's going to be healthy. And he really feels like it's going to be a lot less severe or risk factor of guys on the ice getting sick as they are potentially in the locker room. And he brought up the environmental situations for, look at the mumps and how that spread through multiple teams when they visited what we all think is one locker room, and that is in Anaheim. Although you bring that up to Bruce Boudreau and he will not agree. But anyway, and then, the middle one that I was talking about, so that's COVID-19 and that's the bubble. These players want to know what that is like. But the other big thing here, and I know that fans, especially in society right now where there's unemployment of several million people and pay cuts like we just took the Athletic, or, people are struggling out there, right? So I know that fans don't really appreciate this with millionaire athletes and things like that. But the reality is that the owners and the players have a 50-50 split of revenue. So the players' pie is their salary cap. And if all of a sudden there's $1.5 billion damage to revenue in the NHL, but the players were already making X amount of money, that money essentially has to be paid back to the owners via an escrow account. So what that means is that right now, since none of us really know the damage, they're saying that escrow next year could potentially be 35, 34% or something like that. Well, coming back without fans and just getting maybe a little revenue money from, TV and things like that, they're only saying that maybe it shaves 6 or 7 percentage points off that escrow. So you're still talking 28, 29% potentially that are coming out of these guys' paychecks into account that will eventually go back potentially to the owners, or usually every year guys will get a little bit of their escrow money back in a one-time lump sum paycheck. So the players want to know what is it worth coming back with the amount of money that you all are going to spend on testing us, feeding us, putting us in hotels. Is that worth the revenue that we're going to make and cut down this escrow by this much? And then the other thing that they're going to want to probably get the owners and the league to agree to is that, all right, we understand we got to pay you 28% escrow next season, but let's alleviate some of this burden on us by at least having us pay you back over time, 2 or 3 years, where it's not just an immediate heartache for a lot of these guys. But that becomes difficult when, a guy like, say, Mikko Koivu's in the last year of his contract, and might not be here next year. How does then he pay in future years? I mean, there's it's a complicated mechanism, but the players want to know this right now, because if they're going to hit with a 30% escrow next year or the 35%, and they're already in tax brackets with Social Security and union dues and everything where they're losing pretty much 50% of their salaries. Now all of a sudden they're playing next year for 20% and they, or less. And so they want to know the answers to this now. So those are the 3 big things that have to be negotiated. And it's why we're now suddenly seeing phase 3 probably not starting until July, because I don't think this is something that they can overnight figure out, and then the players are going to want to vote on it. And so, that's why I wrote that story through the eyes of Devin Dubnyk a couple of weeks ago, that just kind of warned fans like, hey, I know that you're all excited that they announced this return to play format, but this is just the format. This is, if they play, this is what it's going to be. But if they play, it's still a huge hurdle to overcome, and all that stuff is going on behind the scenes right now.
Yeah, no, anyone who kind of follows the league closely, whether you like it or not, knows that escrow has always been kind of a big thing that the players have been going on about, and one of the bigger things on the next collective bargaining agreement, if I remember right. But
yeah, no doubt about it. That's one of the big things that they're going to try to do. And again, I mean, the CBA negotiations are going on right now. A lot of that has to do with that's all part of this as well, Olympics and things like that. The one good thing I will say, if you're a hockey fan, is I think that the damage that's been done to the business right now is going to make both sides realize they got to get a CBA done to make sure that in 2 years from now that there is not a work stoppage in the NHL, because I don't think the league could take that on the after this. And then the other thing, not to scare fans, but this is how I always think, is like, a big concern is, like, I think the NHL really wants to push the 2021 season back as far as possible too, is because they want fans in the crowd, but they want a reputable vaccine out there, because they are really worried. What if there's a second wave of COVID-19 in the country and they start hockey and have to start it and have to stop it again? And so they want to push next season back as far as possible to, potentially have a lot of these things addressed. One thing I will say that I don't know if it's going to happen, but Bill Maurice brought up to me that I'll put in this article next week is, there are companies like Merck and other companies that do have vaccines now that they are testing, and he's wondering if the NHL would want to be a trial balloon for some of these vaccines and have some of these guys actually take it. And I don't know if the league would ever consider that, but that is something else that maybe this summer. Not only do you have the treatments, you have the antibodies, you have the quarantine, but maybe there are guys that want to be part of a trial to actually take a vaccine.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions here for you, Mike, before we let you go. And these are our kind of last questions we always ask to all our guests here. The first of which is, Ben and I are huge hockey jersey fans / critics, and we always have to ask our guests if they have a favorite or favorites from anywhere, any league, pretty much anything. Like, what would be your go-to hockey jersey?
Yeah, I mean, blue is my favorite color. So I love the Rangers home jerseys, and I love the Islanders home jerseys. Same thing. I love like the Winnipeg Jets home jerseys. I love the San Jose Sharks when they were wearing the teal. So I would say those type of colors, anything like that would be my favorite. But anybody that knows me, I grew up an Islanders fan. That's how I fell in love with the sport. I used to rummage through the garbage of players at their homes. That's the type of freaking rube I was as a young kid. And I'm not even joking. I used to like sit outside like Brian Trottier and Mike Bossy's house and like go through the garbage cans with friends of mine, hoping that like some Islanders jersey or a hat or something would wind up in there and I could take it. So I would say probably if I had to pick one, I'd go with the Islanders. But I love those Winnipeg Blues, the third jersey that they wore this year. Some people don't love it. I like it. Huge Shark. Like, I've always loved the Sharks jerseys. And again, like being a fan of blue, I just love the blue shirts of the Rangers.
Nice.
Yeah, no, those are all good. And then the last question, Mike, and this was a question that we debate ourselves time and again, and it brings out the best from our guests, including Bruce Boudreau, who said, of all the things you guys argue about on this podcast, why do you argue about this? we always have to ask, do you consider soup to be a meal?
Well, I'm a huge Seinfeld fan, and I have had this debate with a lot of friends. It really depends on the circumstance. Like to me, that meal that Jerry had with the soup should have been a meal. He shouldn't have to just now go out to lunch with the guy that he can't stand anymore anyway. So I do think that soup is a meal.
Yes. Beautiful.
Disappointing.
That's good. I'm actually in the middle of
what was
watching
Bruce's answer?
He kind of had if I remember, he had a kind of diplomatic answer to it. It was he was starting to lean towards soup is a meal, but then he kind of went back and kind of went in between. So there was a lot of variables that went into his answer.
My first ever sit down with Bruce Boudreau when he was when he was named coach of the Wild. I took him to Tom Reed's for the interview, and it was one of those. You know how on Monday to Friday they have the soup and salad buffet at Tom Reed's? It's unbelievable, by the way. They get 4 homemade soups, a great salad bar with protein, and it's like honestly like $8.95 or $9.95. It's the best deal in town. And so the reason why I'm shocked that Bruce didn't say that soup is 100% a meal is that that's all he ate there. And he actually, I'll never forget this as long as I lived, he mixed 3 different soups together. And I just thought it was the craziest thing, to the point that I actually was like distracted by watching him eat it, because I just couldn't believe that he took like 3 different things of soups and mixed them. So Bruce is a beauty, man.
It's wonderful.
I'm glad that you guys got him on the podcast. One of my favorite, like that nobody would ever guess about Bruce Boudreau is that he hates cheese. He despises cheese. He cannot eat it. If there's the only thing that he likes cheese on is pizza, but I remember we were in Edmonton and after practice, like the lunch for the team was like chicken parmesan, and Andrew Whitey, the team services guy, made sure to get him a chicken parmesan without the parmesan. Same thing whenever I've been out to lunch with him and he gets a cheeseburger, he'll actually say a cheeseburger without the cheese. And I'm like, well, why don't you just order the hamburger? So it's pretty funny. It's one of those. It's one of those things that you'd never know about Bruce.
Yeah, just from a covering the team standpoint, it was a sad day when Bruce was let go. You understand it from the hockey side, but just the personality that he is, that was a little tougher to take, just because he made it that much more entertaining to follow. Just even you always look at quotes just from practice, because he'd always have a witty answer in there somewhere. So that
he made it fun, and like you said, I mean, look, it was a sad day for me too. You still go to work and write it, but even though all coaches are going to be fired at some point during your tenure of covering them, he was definitely one of my favorite people to be around. I'm still tight with him. And it's funny because most coaches I've ever covered, and I've covered more than a dozen in the NHL between Florida and Minnesota, I'm still tight with after covering them. And it's because you deal with them on such an individual basis that you just kind of, you shoot the breeze about hockey, and anybody that loves hockey and has a passion for hockey and knows hockey, coaches respect right off the hop. And so that's what I loved about Bruce, is he literally is an everyman. He is the guy that you could sit up, cozy up to at the bar, know it's Bruce Boudreau, and he'll talk to anybody if you want to talk sports with him. That's why he came on your podcast. He's that type of guy. And, but yet, I mean, all good things come to an end, right? Then you just move on. And, I remember when Dean Evason took over as the Minnesota Wild coach, he and I talked after his first press conference, and I think he was concerned that because of my relationship with Paul Fenton and because of how tight I was with Bruce Boudreau, that I would, maybe take it out on him. And I had to let him, first of all, I'm a professional. And 2, I've covered a gazillion coaching changes in my career, a gazillion GM changes, ownership changes, things like that. This is the job. Players are traded even if you like them. Coaches are fired even if you like them. And then you move on to the next guy and you cover them. And that's why that's the job here. And so now we'll see if Dean Evison, I think the one thing that I think all Wild fans have learned a lot about Dean in the last couple of months is how good his personality is, and I think they're learning more about him every time he goes on the radio or podcasts or articles or things like that. And so that's the world. And now we'll see if Dean Evison can build a career for himself behind the bench by the Wild coming back this summer, doing well, and maybe he's the head coach of the Minnesota Wild next year, or at the very minimum, he proves himself to the point that he could be a head coach somewhere else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, Mike, we've certainly taken up enough of your time. We are very grateful for you taking some time to chat with us. And as always, thank you for your coverage, because it gives guys like us something to talk about every week on this otherwise fine podcast. So we certainly appreciate it.
Well, no, I appreciate you guys. I love reading you guys as well. Love listening to the show. And yeah, by the way, if you don't subscribe to The Athletic, definitely subscribe. I guarantee you'll love it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's always my my go-to in the morning, so I can echo that as well. So, Mike, thank you so much for joining us, and we will chat with you again sometime down the road.
Yep. See you guys.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
As always, a very thorough answer. Mike Russo was kind enough to join us again. We could not be more appreciative of his time. Obviously he's full on always doing work covering the Wild and the NHL, and so it was fun just to chat with him. And I'm not over that Bruce smashing soups together. Also cheese. We might need to get Bruce back on the horn just to talk about food.
Yeah. I was also taken with Mike's interview, and we know this. We know Mike knows everything, and he's like the insider, especially when it relates to anything Wild. But it really struck me like how much he talked about stuff that he can't say and stuff that he can't print. And it's like, again, we knew going into this, we always know that Russo knows more than anyone and knows more than he can say. But it's just like, I just was kind of staggered thinking about it while he was talking, like the amount of stuff that he can't put into print, right, and how much it would make all of our collective heads explode 10 million times is just incredible. Like the stuff that he can't say, like, could write as many articles as he writes, which is saying something. And obviously, I mean, the scoops that he couldn't even write about are just unimaginable.
Right. Yeah, that was fun. We hope you enjoyed the podcast. And if you're a new listener to the show and you want to check out others, feel free to check out our shows on whatever platform you do listen to. We've had some great guests here over the pause. In addition to Mike, we've had Greg Wyshynski of ESPN. As you mentioned, we've had Bruce Boudreau on for a little bit to just talk hockey. That was honestly one of the best ones we've done.
It was great.
So we encourage you to check out our other shows. And yeah, we'll call it a show. If you subscribe via iTunes, leave us a rating. It is much appreciated. Spotify, Google Play, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, we're all there. We also write, as Mike alluded to, at zonecoverage.com. You can go to zonecoverage.com/wild and find daily content on the site. During this pause, as we're talking about just a little bit of everything, trying to keep you as well informed as Mike is, and invoke some thoughts on some other things. So do give that a look. And that will do it for us. We will be back early early in the week with another show, and we will chat with you again next week.
Later.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Gill and the Goaltender podcast.
That's not resiliency. You're making it sound like we're good. That's all. I'm done.